Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard. This is your captain speaking, Debbie Buyaki. Today we'll be taking a flight over nature's view, a 2030 climate journey story. Kicking off from Nairobi all the way to Egypt and the Mediterranean Red Sea region. I hope you enjoy this climate journey story. Seatbelts on and wheels up. My guest today has studied law and politics and is involved in ocean conservation and climate education. She's a member of IRENA's Youth Forum and was a youth delegate in the 9th and 10th Assembly sessions, as well as COP27, where she presented in the first MENA Ocean Action Plan. She's the youngest member of Sustainable Ocean Alliance Youth Policy Advisory Council of 2022, serving as Secretary and Representative of Egypt. She's passionate about members most affected by the lack of urgency in the climate crisis and has thus founded Eco.Spectrum, the first organization in the world aiming to elevate the inclusivity of youth in the spectrum of autism in ocean conservation discussions. Amazing. She's currently launching the As4 initiative, working with indigenous local Egyptian communities living on the coasts of the Nile, Mediterranean, and Red Sea regions to elevate their stories and provide an accessible and localized ocean literacy curriculum while making businesses zero plastic waste producers via creating handmade crocheted marine dolls stuffed with collected marine plastic waste and debris. You should check them out. They're really cute. Going to our guest now. Hi, please introduce yourself, your name, where you're from, and what you're currently into.
Okay. Hello, my name is Dana Ahmed. I am Egyptian, but I was born and raised in Abu Dhabi, on the coasts of Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates. And I am an ocean advocate and the founder of Eco.Spectrum, which is an organization that aims to accelerate climate and specifically ocean literacy for youth on the autism spectrum.
All right, thank you for that. Tell us some general ocean facts, like how many oceans are there on Earth and what their general role is in the ecosystem.
Yeah, so there are 5 oceans. There's the Southern, Arctic, Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific. And the oceans are the largest carbon sink that we have. So the health of our ocean is inextricably linked to the health of people and the health of any living marine or non-marine species on the planet. And the fact that it is the largest carbon sink means that it absorbs all the excess heat and energy that is released from the rising greenhouse gas emissions trapped in the Earth's system. So statistically, they absorb 25% of CO2 and traps over 90% of excess heat into the atmosphere, and also releases 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. But also the ocean covers about over 70% of the planet. And also statistically, 3.3 billion people are directly reliant on oceans for food, jobs, and transport. But looking at the role of oceans as the largest carbon sink and as something that we are connected to, regardless of whether we are coastal communities or non-coastal communities, we are all reliant on the ocean. So it is inevitably also bound to grow even bigger now, today, in this day and age, because industries now are recently tapping into all the sustainable and unsustainable ventures and businesses that arise from the ocean, such as deep seabed mining, aquaculture, carbon dioxide removal, or what is known as CDR in fisheries. This is kind of a general overview of how important the ocean is, but it is important economically, politically, socially, and also from a health perspective as well.
I did not know that much. I think you mentioned it is the largest carbon sink. So what is the role of the oceans in sequestering carbon and their part in climate change?
Yeah, it is the largest carbon sink. So carbon sequestration, basically, the ocean secures carbon dioxide to prevent it from entering into the Earth's atmosphere. But as it is securing all this carbon, it is getting warmer, which then lessens its ability to store more CO2 and more greenhouse gases. So it is released more into the atmosphere, and then it also heightens global warming. So the idea is with carbon sequestration is to stabilize carbon into solid or the solid forms so that it doesn't cause the atmosphere to warm. And that is done either biologically through like natural resources such as like seaweed, for example, or the mangroves. So these are all like biological ecosystems that are able to store CO2 in the ocean. But then there are also physical or non-biological forms for carbon sequestration, and this involves some kind of human or man-made intervention. Either or, obviously, they both have their kind of pros and cons, but the best way to obviously go about it is to rely on the biological forms of the ocean that it already gives us. But as the ecosystem is warming, as greenhouse gas emissions are rising, as our leaders are burning more fossil fuels, the ocean's capacity to store carbon dioxide is lessening. And that cannot be ignored because this has long-term and irreversible impacts. I've touched a bit on deep seabed mining, but this is, for example, an industry, an extractive industry that has the potential to, as we are speaking now, 29th, I think, council session is happening now at the International Seabed Authority, but this is an extractive industry that has the potential of completely destroying the ocean, and it will completely also destroy its ability and its capacity to store CO2 into the atmosphere. So I think there is a lot of misconceptions and also ignorance about how much we need the ocean, and carbon sequestration is definitely one of the top topics that I think we need to really understand very, very well so that we are able to deep how important the ocean can be in the fight against climate change. It is our biggest guard and warrior against climate change.
All right, thank you for that. And it's almost leading towards the argument I always have on adaptation and mitigation. It's the same thing on biological forms, on non-biological forms of the sequestration, but we'll not get there. So some troubles that face the ocean, I'd like us to talk more about them. What are some of the issues that you think are the biggest troubles of the ocean? I don't know, mining, plastic, stuff like that. What do you think are the major ones?
So something that I've been working towards advocating in my own work, because I also think it is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, industry that is troubling the ocean, is deep seabed mining. Deep seabed mining is this very extractive industry that involves the extraction of rare earth minerals like cobalt, manganese, lithium, nickel from the deep sea. So in areas that are below 600 feet or 200 meters in international waters, or what are also called the high seas, which are basically areas of the ocean that are beyond national jurisdictions. So they're not controlled by any state. So rare earth minerals, basically they are needed for sustainable solutions that are often mined from land, but industries now are looking to mine the sea. But unfortunately, the studies have shown that mining the sea floor, it's a very, very intricate ecosystem. So it is going to cause irreversible ecological damage because these minerals take 13 million years to form. And we still are dealing with industries that are trying to pursue this extractive industry under the assumption that we have to choose between land and the ocean, when that is really not the case. So if deep seabed mining goes ahead, it will completely destroy the ocean. It will take millions of years to recover, if at all. And the irreversible destruction will interfere with the life-serving functions of the ocean that we know now. So these polymetallic nodules, these rare earth minerals, they store carbon in the seabed. So as I said, it's a form of biological carbon removal, CDR, carbon dioxide removal. And it is often said that deep seabed mining is like clear cutting the ocean. So for example, you know how there has been examples of clear cutting the Amazon forest? Deep seabed mining is basically like clear cutting the ocean. So biodiversity loss from the deep sea is guaranteed and is unavoidable, and it hasn't even been explored to its deepest extent yet. Science has yet to even explore how far this damage can go. So it will disrupt the life of deep sea creatures such as whales that we know through things like, which may not seem as big of a deal to us as humans, but these species developed through being light and noise sensitive to help them navigate and communicate, to survive, to help them find food, to help them navigate in the ocean. So toxic metals are also introduced through deep seabed mining, so to also affect the food systems of these species. We also know very little about this ecosystem regardless. So over 99% of the seafloor isn't even discovered yet. And deep seabed mining will permanently destroy this very fragile ecosystem before we even get the chance to explore it. So the industry's impacts are so large in scale and capacity that we have yet to even understand the true extent of its destruction. And to put it even to a little bit of context, we know more about the moon and Mars than we know about the deep sea. And we also tend to forget some very vital information that we have developed and learned from the deep seas. For example, a critical COVID-19 test element was actually discovered from a microbe in the hydrothermal vents in the deep sea. So again, the extent of scarce knowledge that can be garnered and learned from the deep sea that we have yet to tap into is massive. And any interference with that will also interfere with our survival as human beings, as ocean-reliant beings. So isn't disrupting ancient carbon sinks the reason that we are facing climate change in the first place? So why is deep seabed mining even an option? And again, I've mentioned this briefly before. As we are speaking right now, the 29th session of the International Seabed Authority is convening to discuss the negotiations of the development of rules and regulations and procedures relating to what they call the commercial exploitation of mineral resources from the deep sea. So in July 2023, the Council said that they intend to continue the elaboration of the regulations and procedures, rules, regulations and procedures, or the RRPs, in accordance with UNCLOS, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And something as well, another extractive industry, something that we see in my part of the world more often, alongside sea mining, is also overfishing. So we often get these big boats, for example, in Egypt, called chinchula boats, that are commercial fishing boats. So they are very, very destructive to the Red Sea, which is identified, actually, the Red Sea is identified as a hope spot by Mission Blue, as it has been proven scientifically that it hosts the most resilient and what will be the last surviving corals in the world, which will then aid the development of artificial reefs and DNA testing in the future for the growth of marine ecosystems. So again, a very fragile and vulnerable ecosystem that is subject to very commercial and extractive industries. And this also impacts indigenous communities because it limits the capacity of how much they can fish when governments and NGOs look at introducing fish quotas. Additionally, they also harm. Overfishing completely destructs the food systems of our Red Sea. So it endangers a lot of marine species such as the green sea turtle and the hawksbill sea turtle and the Napoleon fish, which are all local to the Red Sea. So it doesn't just limit the food resources of indigenous communities, but also a lot of our communities rely on tourism for jobs. So the destruction of our marine ecosystem is also a direct threat to the tourism industry in Egypt, which is a primary source of income. So, for example, also to put it into a bit of context, one dugong in the Red Sea Governorate Abu Dabbab Bay can generate alone $1.8 million of profit from divers and snorkelers who are coming from all over the world to see it. So this is just one country alone. Imagine how many communities are dependent on this source of income worldwide, such as, for example, Pacific Island nations to the Caribbean islands.
Exactly why we needed to have an episode on oceans. Thank you so much for explaining that. And it's so interesting or heartbreaking to see what the depths humanity can do and go, even with the science being presented to them. Well, speaking of humanity and what's in our hearts, in regards to our planet and how we treat it, I would ask the question of, we always tend to take from the ocean and other ecosystems as well. So what sustainable practices can be done to ensure a regenerative ocean ecosystem?
So one of the most effective solutions that I have found from my experience to the ocean crisis has always been education and awareness, and particularly as well the accessibility of education and awareness for vulnerable communities and youth. So there has to be some sort of intergenerational connection between the indigenous and ancestral knowledge that has been passed down to us through generations, and also between the new technology and the science that has now been developed recently. Both of these sources of information and education needs to be accessible for everyone. But unfortunately, there are so many communities that are very underrepresented and underserved because we have yet to develop a common spoken language in which we are able to make this information accessible. And by language, I don't mean Arabic, English, or Spanish. I'm not talking about the linguistics. I'm talking about a framework, an organized structure in which we can easily communicate the new and indigenous advancements in ocean learnings to the new generations, regardless of their backgrounds, but also whilst ensuring that our elders have a similar access to these new technological developments to ocean science and information. And this cannot be achieved by a small group of people. It cannot be achieved by myself alone or or you alone, because this is a structural issue. And fortunately, this issue has been given the space to grow via things like colonization and supremacy that made accessibility to vital, life-serving education and knowledge subject to class biases and prejudice. So it dismisses the fact that indigenous communities have the most ecologically sustainable ventures and solutions that simply could not be developed without the lifelong experiences of indigenous people. So, for example, from my experience, the Bedouin women of Kursai Island from the Nile, which is a community that I work very closely with, developed a way in which they can sanitize plastic. They do that because, for example, I work on an initiative called the Asfour Initiative, which is basically we crochet marine dolls, which are dolls that are in the shape of marine species. And crocheting is a very common skill that Bedouin women on the Nile have. So I utilize this skill so that they can crochet these marine dolls, and then they stuff them with plastic that are collected from the Nile and the Red Sea. And then these dolls are sold abroad beyond Egypt's borders, so in the US or in Europe. And then all the profits that are generated are reinvested back into the island so that basically create the first fully accessible ocean literacy curriculum for illiterate children and youth, because the illiteracy rate in these places is very, very high. So these women have developed a way in which they can sanitize this plastic that they use to stuff these Asfour dolls with almost little to no resources, and it becomes fully sanitized. So imagine a large-scale operation of that solution that is coupled with the scientific data and advanced technologies to carry it out all across the world. It is a mere gap in accessibility that continues to hold us back in different places when looking at viable solutions for the ocean crisis. And you said a regenerative ocean system. A regenerative ocean system means that you cannot leave anyone behind, truly not leaving anyone behind. Not the illiterate, not the youth, not the Bedouin, not the indigenous, not the neurodivergent, not the disabled. All these forgotten communities that have a gold mine of solutions waiting to be discovered.
And I think indigenous knowledge is something I have been mentioning. I'm honestly so much into what we cannot ignore. The people who've taken care of the earth for millennia in ways that we did not have the technology then, but still they managed to protect the earth. So having them on board is something we're not only advocating for in terms of tokenizing, but it's because it's worked for them. It has to work for us if we learn from them. And something that you mentioned, which will also lead to the next question, what ocean conservation by a person or group would you like to spotlight? You mentioned one. Maybe you could mention another.
Oh, this is, when I was reading this was my favorite question. I have three, if that's okay. So one is the Thalassophile Project, which is an organization that is very, very near to my heart because the founder is an amazing person. But the Thalassophile Project is an organization that makes marine science accessible for deaf and blind people. So again, it taps into the accessibility of education or ocean literacy and information. And they have recently also launched an educational digital series in international sign language with ocean literacy fact sheets and resources that can be standardized and used across the world. So I work also very closely with them as well at Eco.Spectrum, because we are also working into making ocean literacy accessible, but we work with another community, the neurodivergent and autistic children and youth. Another organization as well that I've learned personally so much from is the Oxygen Project, because they do a lot of research on deep seabed mining, as I've mentioned previously, and most of the information that I've mentioned about deep seabed mining, I've actually learned from them. They have also recently reported on the water crisis in Gaza, in Palestine, and highlighted that the ocean crisis is indirectly a water crisis because all the water facilities in Gaza have been destroyed, making 95% of the water in Gaza unfit for human consumption. So they highlighted how there cannot be ocean justice on occupied land, and they also tap into ocean justice as well as science and research in the oceans. And then one last organization as well is Global Choices, or Arctic Angels. And this is a network that I'm part of. It's an all-female network that advocates for the protection of the Arctic ice shield that is critical for the survival of the ocean and its life above and below water. Because the Arctic is the central cooling system of our planet. The Arctic, unfortunately, now is warming 3 times faster as the rest of the globe. And this is something called the Arctic amplification, when it is a very vital guard against climate change. So For example, I've mentioned a bit about carbon sequestration, but the Arctic is the final stop in the AMOC process, which stands for the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. And the AMOC basically carries warm ocean water northwards towards the pole, where it cools and sinks due to its salt content. And then low temperatures and a high salt content makes the water denser. So this dense water then sinks deep into the ocean, and then with the warmer and fresher water, it stays closer to the surface, so it rises. And then the water, it moves then in a circulation. It moves northwards, and then it cools, and then some of it evaporates. Then that increases its saltiness, and then the cooler and denser the water then moves southward, and it's pulled back to the surface, and then warms back in a process called upwelling. And then as the temperatures on Earth rise because of climate change, the influx of cool, fresh water then disrupts the sinking of salty water, and then that weakens the AMOC process. Scientists say that the AMOC is weakening by 15%. That causes a decrease in the ocean's effectiveness in absorbing the atmospheric carbon dioxide. And this leads to a higher amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and global warming. So there have also been studies that suggest that there's a potential of the AMOC completely shutting down as a result of climate change, which is scary, it's terrifying, because that will inevitably impact every person on the planet, because it will raise temperatures near the equator and deliver more extreme winters all across the world. But also the worst impact of climate change, like the rising sea levels, rising temperatures, loss of land and people from intense storms and rainfalls and heat waves, are all factors that are a direct impact of the melting of the ice shield that has the potential of shutting down the AMOC completely.
Thank you for spotlighting all those amazing people who are working on incredible projects and initiatives. I don't know, I have not had a lot on them, but they're amazing. When you talk about advocacy, it's mostly quite lenient, and we don't talk about neurodivergent people. We don't talk about the people with disabilities who still exist on the planet and need to be involved in their own way, and so take part in this whole concept. We need everyone and anyone to help in whichever way they can, and that's nice. I might just bring someone to talk about ice, but let me not give it out, as we also try to run down our topic of today on oceans. Fun fact, Diana is a scuba diver, and I'd like her to tell us some fun facts about the depths of the ocean, or your concerns about what you have seen and ways you're trying to take action individually.
So one of the most interesting fun facts about the ocean, I like fish, so I will have some interesting facts about the fish, especially the ones in the Red Sea where I'm from. So the Red Sea, they have one of the most common fishes, the parrotfish. And I find parrotfish very interesting because through their powerful beaks, the parrotfish can munch on the corals with a rate of, I think it was 20 bites per minute, about 20 bites per minute, which is a lot. And also the parrotfish feces, they contribute to the coral sand found on our reefs to help form reef islands. And it is estimated that a single parrotfish could produce up to 90 kilograms of sand each year. So they help us protect the coral from obviously being overwhelmed by algae because of their powerful beaks. They're able to digest the reef rock along with the algae and then excreting it as sand. So one way you could look at it is actually, if you are on a beach that has a lot of parrotfish, you could be standing on the parrotfish's feces. Another fish that I really like is the lionfish. This is arguably the most famous fish in the Red Sea because it's native, but it's very controversial. It's invasive in many parts of the world, but luckily it's native to the Red Sea. They are one of the most poisonous fish in the world, but I personally love them because they are an example of how nature can surprise us with its beauty and diversity, but also how we need to treat it responsibly because it can be an asset and a challenge because it's obviously invasive in different parts of the world. Barracudas are also very interesting because they are intelligent. I think they swim at a speed of 44 kilometers per hour, which is quite fast. But also sometimes they're so intelligent because sometimes they act collectively to for example, herd a school of fish into shallow waters, and then they stand guard until they are hungry enough and then they attack and eat them. And I've seen that with my own eyes, which was a bit scary, but I also found them really, really interesting. You also asked what are the concerns that I've seen. I've mentioned this a bit, overfishing. I've seen overfishing happen. I've seen also not overfishing, but also mooring issues that are happen. So instead of, for example, the diving boats, when they attach their boats to a mooring vessel, instead they attach it to coral reef and then the coral reef completely basically dies or breaks, which is very terrifying and scary given that the Red Sea has the most valuable coral reefs in the world. So what I do usually is I organize like small dives or beach cleanups when I can, but I also acknowledge that, again, this is an issue of accessibility. There's a lot of information on ocean protection that is very inaccessible, especially in my part of the world, because this also makes this information very scarce. So, for example, the mooring issue in Egypt, it doesn't just happen in one part of the Red Sea. It happens all across the Red Sea. Even the locals on diving boats and the ships, they're not aware of the potential impact of their unsustainable practices. So I personally always try to make sure that I'm able to communicate the impact of this destruction of corals and the disturbing of marine life when I can. But I also understand that it is an issue of accessibility. So yeah, if I were to advise anyone listening to this podcast, I would tell everyone to use their privilege and learn and help other people to learn or unlearn about the impacts of their actions on oceans and marine life when possible, because a lot of this information is very, very inaccessible even to the locals.
All right, thank you so much for sharing with us all those facts. I think it was an interesting set of facts that you chose, and I think sea creatures are quite interesting, and I've been reading a few about dolphins as well, and how they're a bit of like us in a sense, and they're also individualistic as much as we are.
They're very aggressive. The dolphins are super, super aggressive. They're very, very playful, but they can also be very aggressive because of the nature in which they have been commercialized and extracted. They learn from each other. They're very, very clever. So they're very interesting as well to learn about it.
Of course, as there are thousands of facts about the ocean, I think the ocean is the most untalked about when it comes to climate. We always talk about everything, and much of the ocean is quite ignored. Or maybe, as you said, the information is scarce and not accessible to everyone. But now we have a podcast and an episode that's full of it. Lucky us. So as we conclude, this is just off the top. What gives you hope in your work?
What gives me hope is I see change happening. I see a ripple effect happening, especially when it comes to oceans. People are learning from each other. People are passing down information. And I get a lot of my hope from the indigenous community and the indigenous communities on the Red Sea and in the Nile, because they have gone through everything. They have seen wars, they have seen violence, they have seen aggression, they have seen poverty. Most of them are living below the poverty line, and yet they still have the courage and the bravery to come out and speak about their stories and talk about what they've seen and welcome everyone really with open arms, anyone who's trying to learn. They're just waiting to be asked. They're just waiting for someone to ask them about what their ocean story is, or what their struggles are. So they give me a lot of hope, because you would expect that a group of people who have been exploited as much as they have would just have lost hope and would not have any hope in any solutions or any change happening. But no, they stick to their solutions, and they stand their ground when it comes to anyone asking about what they think the most viable or the most effective solutions are. They introduce them, and they advocate for them wholeheartedly, and they show up with so much love. And that's just very reflective of how the ocean truly is a source that connects us so much. I love working with coastal communities, and I think that's one of the biggest privileges that I have. Also, one more thing, the ocean's marine life gives me hope, because I am someone who can spend hours looking at fish from anywhere. If I'm diving, I will look at fish. I will just look at fish. I won't even swim. I won't explore anything except just look at the intricacies and the different behaviors of fish, because I find that really, really fascinating. But it's something worth protecting.
Great. Thank you so much for such a heartfelt answer and for agreeing to speak to us about oceans. I hope we continue to engage and involve everyone who can and should be involved in protecting oceans, which is such a huge part of the earth and our lives as a whole, which we hardly talk about or try to maintain or conserve at all. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope everyone has learned a few tips about the ocean. And if you live near one, please join a local group and start its conservation. We need it to. I'll see you in the next fight. Take care, and for Earth.